The ship landed with a slow hiss, dust swirling around its landing gear as the ramp unfolded onto the dry ground. The air smelled of soil and sunlight, a scent that didn't exist on the shining cities Alara had come from. She held her small bag tightly, her heart racing faster than she wanted to admit. Everything she owned was in that bag. Some clothes, a book of stories from her home, and a small photo of her family. She had never been so far from home before. The colony she came from was crowded, the sky always filled with smoke from the tall buildings and trade ships. When she signed up for the Frontier Family Program, she thought it would lead her to a new beginning. They had shown her a picture of a quiet planet, green fields, and a strong man named Samuel Hart who needed a partner to help him rebuild his life. The file said he was a farmer, widowed, living alone for many years. She thought he looked older but kind. She didn't expect him to look so tired. When Alara stepped off the ramp, the wind lifted her long dress and tangled her hair. She saw him waiting beside an old truck, his hat shading most of his face. He stood tall, though his shoulders were slightly bent and his hands were rough and dark from years under the sun. He looked up as she approached, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Samuel took off his hat politely, and Alara saw his face clearly for the first time. Deep lines framed his mouth, his beard was silver gray, and his eyes, though tired, held a softness she didn't expect. He looked like a man who had carried the world on his back and somehow kept walking. "You must be Alara," he said, his voice low and rough like gravel under boots. She nodded, her throat too tight to speak. He gave a small, awkward smile. "You must have expected someone younger." She blinked, unsure how to respond. The wind blew between them again, silent and honest. He rubbed his hand over his face, looking down for a moment before saying softly, "War and farming did this to me." There was no bitterness in his tone, only quiet truth. He didn't say it as an excuse, only as a fact of his life. Alara smiled faintly. "You worked hard," she said gently. He looked up at her then, surprised by the warmth in her voice. "That's one way to say it," he replied with a small chuckle. He picked up her bag as though it weighed nothing, and gestured toward the old truck. It was rusty in places, but clean and cared for, much like the man himself. She climbed in, and they drove off along the dusty road. The landscape around them stretched endlessly, fields of faded gold, scattered barns, and the distant shimmer of mountains. The sun hung low, coloring everything in warm orange light. Samuel kept his eyes on the road, both hands on the steering wheel, occasionally glancing at her as though to make sure she was really there. "Not much to see," he said quietly after a long silence. "It's beautiful," Alara whispered, her eyes fixed on the wide horizon. She had never seen so much open space. He smiled faintly but didn't answer. The truck bumped along the road for nearly an hour before reaching the farmhouse. It stood on a small rise surrounded by fields. The house was old but strong, its white paint faded by years of sun and rain. A wooden porch wrapped around the front, and the air smelled of hay and earth. Chickens moved slowly near the fence, and somewhere in the distance a cow mooed softly. Samuel parked the truck and stepped out. "Welcome home," he said simply. Alara hesitated before following him. Home. The word felt heavy, unfamiliar, but somehow comforting. Inside, the house was clean but quiet. Wooden floors, handmade furniture, and an old fireplace filled the living room. She noticed photographs on the wall, black and white pictures of younger men in uniforms and one of a woman with soft eyes holding a child. Samuel noticed her looking and cleared his throat. "That was my wife," he said quietly. "She passed a long time ago." Alara lowered her eyes respectfully. "I'm sorry," she said. He nodded. "Life has its seasons," he murmured. He showed her to a small room with a window that looked out over the fields. The bed had a handmade quilt on it, and a vase with dried flowers sat on the table. It was simple, but full of care. "If you need anything, you let me know," Samuel said, standing by the door. "The mornings come early here. I'll be in the fields before sunrise." She nodded again. "Thank you, Samuel." He paused for a moment, his eyes softening. "You can call me Sam if you like." When he left, Alara sat on the edge of the bed and looked out the window. The sky had turned pink and purple, and the fields seemed endless. She felt a mixture of sadness and hope. This was her new life, a quiet planet, a man she barely knew, and the sound of the wind whispering through old wooden walls. That night, as she unpacked her few belongings, she heard him moving around downstairs, closing doors, checking the animals, humming softly to himself. It was a lonely sound, but somehow full of peace. Alara lay down, staring at the ceiling. She thought about his words again. War and farming did this to me. She imagined him younger, fighting battles far from home, then returning to work the land year after year, alone but unbroken. Maybe, she thought, people like him didn't need to be perfect. Maybe they just needed someone to remind them they were still human. Outside, the wind carried the soft sound of crickets, and the moon rose slowly above the fields. The world was silent, but in that silence she felt something beginning, something small and uncertain but real. When Samuel checked the porch before going to bed, he glanced up at her window. The light was still on. He smiled faintly, removed his hat, and whispered to himself, maybe this house won't be so quiet anymore. Then he turned off the porch light, and the old farmhouse stood under the stars. Two strangers inside it, both searching for a kind of peace they hadn't known for years. The days that followed were quiet. So quiet that Alara could hear the ticking of the old clock in the hallway and the soft creak of the wooden floorboards every time the wind moved through the house. The silence wasn't empty. It was heavy, like the walls were holding years of unspoken words. Each morning, Samuel was up before sunrise. She could hear his boots on the floor and the door closing as he went out to the fields. By the time the sun rose, he was already working, feeding the animals, fixing fences, checking the crops. Alara would watch from the window for a few minutes before starting her own routine. She made tea, swept the floors, and tried to make the house feel more alive. She was used to the noise of her home world, the sound of people talking, laughing, and machines running all day. Here the only sounds were wind, birds, and Samuel's slow footsteps outside. At first, the quiet made her uneasy. She wanted to talk, to ask questions, to fill the air with something. But she could sense that Samuel wasn't ready for that yet. He spoke only when necessary and always with kindness, but in short, careful sentences. Breakfast on the table, she would say. Thank you, he would reply, sitting down and eating slowly, his hands steady, his eyes lost in thought. One morning, Alara tried to start a conversation. How long have you lived here? She asked. Most of my life, he said, not looking up from his plate. It's beautiful, she said softly. He nodded. It keeps a man honest, he replied. Then he stood, put on his hat, and went outside again. It wasn't that he was cold, he was just quiet, like a man who had learned to live with silence for too long. In the afternoons, when the sun was strong, Alara would walk around the property. She liked to feed the chickens and sometimes hum little songs from her childhood. Samuel would glance at her from the fields but never interrupted. He seemed unsure of how to act around her, grateful for her presence, but careful, as if afraid he might disturb her peace. One evening, after dinner, she washed the dishes while he sat by the fireplace polishing his old tools. The firelight danced across his face, showing the deep lines that told stories of hard work and long years. Alara looked at him quietly. You don't rest much, she said. He smiled faintly. Farmers don't rest. If they do, the land forgets them. She didn't fully understand what he meant, but his tone was soft, not sad. She realized then that he wasn't just working to keep the farm alive. He was working to keep himself alive, to give his hands something to do so his heart wouldn't feel too heavy. Later that night, when she passed by the living room, she saw him standing by the window looking out into the dark fields. The moonlight touched his face, and for a moment he looked younger, like a man remembering something beautiful that once was. She didn't disturb him. She quietly went to her room and wrote in her small notebook. She wrote about how quiet could sometimes feel lonely, but sometimes it could feel peaceful too. Days turned into weeks. Slowly, a rhythm formed between them. She began to cook meals he liked, fresh bread, stew, and pies filled with wild berries she found near the stream. Samuel never said much about the food, but he always finished every bite. Sometimes she caught him smiling faintly after a meal. Once she found an old photograph on the kitchen shelf. Samuel as a young man in a soldier's uniform, standing beside other men. She asked him gently, "Was this from the war?" He nodded. "Long ago. That's where I lost my brother," he said quietly. "We came home different," she didn't ask more. She could see in his eyes that those memories still lived close to the surface. She simply said, "He would be proud you kept going." Samuel looked at her for a long moment, then gave a small, grateful nod. That night, for the first time, they shared tea together after dinner. Sometimes Alara would sit outside on the porch during the evenings, watching the stars. Samuel would join her silently, sitting a few feet away. They didn't talk much, but their silence started to feel different, comfortable, even peaceful. The sound of crickets and the soft rustle of wind through the wheat fields became their unspoken language. One night, while the sky shimmered with stars, Alara said quietly, "It's strange. The stars look the same here as they did back home." Samuel smiled. That's the one thing the universe got right. Stars belong to everyone. She looked at him then, truly looked. Beneath the lines and the tiredness, there was a kind man who had lived through storms, both the kind that come from the sky and the kind that live inside the heart. She realized he didn't need to impress her or hide his age. His honesty, his simple kindness was enough. Every day after that, the house began to change. Alara placed small touches around, the smell of fresh bread in the kitchen, a colorful cloth on the dining table, a vase with wildflowers by the window. Samuel noticed, though he didn't say much. But one morning he paused before heading to the fields and said, "The place feels warmer these days." Alara smiled. Maybe it just needed a little life again. He tipped his hat to her and walked out with a rare smile that lingered even after he left. In the evenings, she began to wait for the sound of his boots returning from the fields. Sometimes he would tell her short stories about the old days, how the crops used to grow taller, how he and his brother once raced horses by the river. His voice always softened when he spoke of the past. Alara listened, sometimes laughing softly, sometimes just nodding. She didn't realize it, but she was becoming part of his story too, filling spaces that had been empty for years. When Samuel fixed a broken fence one afternoon, Alara brought him water. He thanked her, wiping his forehead. "You remind me of spring," he said with a shy grin. "Spring?" she asked, laughing. "Why's that?" "Because things start growing again when you're around." His words were simple, but they stayed with her all day. That night she sat by the window again, watching the stars, and whispered to herself, maybe the silence wasn't waiting for an echo. It was waiting for us. The farmhouse still stood the same, but something invisible had shifted inside it. The quiet was no longer lonely. It had turned into a gentle rhythm of two people slowly learning to live side by side, one with the patience of years, and the other with the hope of new beginnings. It started as a normal day. The sun rose softly over the fields, painting the sky with golden light. Alara stood by the window watching Samuel already out in the field, his figure moving slowly between the rows of crops. He had been up since before dawn, as always, checking the fences and feeding the animals. The wind carried the smell of rain that morning, though the sky still looked clear. Alara made breakfast, warm bread, eggs, and tea, and called him in when she saw him walking back toward the house. "Smells good," Samuel said with a small smile, sitting down at the table. His hands were covered in dirt, but he didn't seem to notice. "There's a storm coming," Alara said as she poured him tea. He nodded, his eyes flicking toward the window. "A small one, maybe. The sky's been restless all week." After breakfast, she helped him bring the animals closer to the barn. The air grew heavier as the morning went on. Dark clouds began to form in the distance, slow and thick like smoke. Samuel looked up at them and frowned. "That doesn't look small anymore," Alara said quietly. "No," he agreed, tightening his hat. "It'll pass, but we'd better be ready." They worked quickly, moving hay bales, locking the chicken coop, and securing the roof panels that often came loose in heavy wind. The first drops of rain fell just as they closed the last barn door. By noon, the rain had turned into sheets of water. The sky darkened to gray and thunder rolled across the hills. The wind howled, pushing against the windows so hard that the frames shook. Alara stood by the door, watching through the glass as Samuel struggled outside, checking the fences one last time. He should come inside, she murmured to herself. She waited, but he didn't return. The sound of the storm grew louder, almost frightening in its force. When lightning flashed across the field, Alara gasped. She could see Samuel out near the cattle pen trying to lift a fallen gate. The wind whipped his coat and rain poured down his face, but he didn't stop. Without thinking twice, Alara grabbed a raincoat and ran outside. The wind hit her like a wall and rain stung her skin like tiny stones. She could barely see through the storm, but she followed his shape in the distance. "Samuel," she shouted, though her voice was nearly lost in the roaring wind. He turned just as another gust pushed him back. "I told you to stay inside," he shouted back. "You can't do this alone," she cried. Her hair stuck to her face and water poured down her arms, but she ran toward him anyway. Together they pushed against the broken gate, lifting it inch by inch. Mud splashed around them, their hands slipping, their clothes soaked. But neither gave up. Samuel's strength met Ilara's determination, and finally, the gate slid back into place. He was breathing heavily, rain dripping from his hair, when he looked at her with a mixture of frustration and admiration. "You shouldn't have come out here," he said. She smiled through the rain. "And let you fight a storm alone? Not a chance." He stared at her for a moment, then laughed softly, shaking his head. "You're stubborn," he said, his voice barely audible over the thunder. "Maybe I learned from you," she replied. The storm raged on, forcing them to take shelter in the barn. They sat side by side, dripping wet, listening to the wind pound against the doors. Inside, the animals were calm now, trusting the safety Samuel had built. Ilara shivered, wrapping her arms around herself. Samuel took off his jacket and draped it over her shoulders without a word. His hands trembled slightly from the cold. "Thank you," she said quietly. He nodded, staring at the rain. "This land, it always tests you," he said slowly. "You think you've tamed it, but you never really do. It's alive. It reminds you who's in charge." She looked at him, seeing something different in his eyes, something raw and honest. "You've been fighting it alone for too long," she said softly. He sighed, the sound heavy with years. "Maybe I have. When you've lost enough people, you stop expecting anyone to stay." Ilara reached out, her hand gently touching his arm. "I'm here," she said simply. "And I'm not leaving because of a little storm." He turned to her, his tired eyes meeting hers. In that moment, the thunder seemed far away. "You remind me of someone," he whispered. "Someone who didn't give up on me either." "Your wife?" she asked softly. He nodded. "She used to run out in the rain too," he said with a small smile. "I'd always tell her to stay inside. She never listened." Ilara smiled back. "Maybe that's what brave women do." They sat in silence for a while, the storm roaring outside but no longer frightening. The barn felt warmer somehow, filled with the steady rhythm of rain and breath. After a long time, the thunder faded. The wind slowed and the rain softened to a steady drizzle. Samuel stood stretching his aching back. "We should check the fields," he said. Ilara followed him outside. The sky was still gray, but the worst had passed. Water glistened on the grass like tiny jewels, and the smell of wet earth filled the air. Most of the fences had held. The barn stood strong. The animals were safe. Samuel looked around and nodded with relief. "You did good," Ilara said, smiling. He looked at her and shook his head. "We did good," he corrected. "Couldn't have done it alone." They walked back to the house together, their boots sinking in the soft mud. The world around them seemed washed clean, brighter somehow. When they reached the porch, Samuel paused and looked at her seriously. "Ilara," he said, "I owe you an apology." She tilted her head. "For what?" "For always apologizing for my age," he said quietly. "You just stood beside me through a storm. Maybe it's time I stop thinking about what I've lost and start seeing what's right here." Ilara's smile was soft, almost shy. "Good," she said, "because I see a man who still fights for everything that matters." Samuel's throat tightened. For a moment he couldn't speak. He simply nodded, looking out at the fields glimmering under the pale light. That night, as they sat by the fire, the air was warm and peaceful. The sound of rain on the roof was gentle now, almost like a lullaby. Ilara sewed a small tear in her sleeve while Samuel sharpened his tools. Their silence was no longer empty. It was full of quiet understanding. When Ilara glanced up, she saw him smiling at her from across the room. "You know," he said softly, "storms used to scare me." She raised an eyebrow. "Really?" He nodded. "Not the thunder or the wind, the silence that comes after." It felt too big, she smiled. "Maybe it doesn't have to feel big anymore," she said. "Not if you have someone to share it with." Samuel looked into the firelight and whispered, "Maybe you're right." Outside, the rain faded completely, and a single star appeared in the night sky. The farmhouse stood steady, its walls glowing with warmth and light. Two people inside, no longer strangers but partners who had faced their first storm together. The days after the storm were bright and gentle, as if the world itself was trying to make up for what it had done. The air was fresh, the sky a clean shade of blue, and the fields glowed in the sunlight. Samuel walked through the land each morning, checking every fence and corner. He found things to repair, but nothing too serious. The house had held strong, and so had they. Alara watched him from the porch as he worked. There was something steady about him, how he moved slowly but with purpose, how his hands seemed to understand the rhythm of the earth. She admired it quietly. He didn't rush through life. He lived it, one small task at a time. Every evening he came back to the house with his boots heavy with mud. He would wash up by the well, then sit by the fire while she prepared dinner. Their words had grown easier now, not forced or shy. Sometimes they talked about small things, the weather, the crops, the stars. But sometimes Samuel would tell her stories from long ago. One evening, while the fire crackled softly, Samuel said, "When I was young, I thought war was the hardest thing a man could live through. I was wrong. Coming home was harder. The world keeps going, but you come back. Changed." Alara looked at him quietly. "You still came back," she said. "That means something." He smiled faintly, eyes glimmering in the firelight. "Maybe, but it takes more than a man to bring life back into a place. It takes someone like you." Alara felt her cheeks warm but didn't look away. "I only do what I can." "That's what makes the difference," he said softly. As the weeks passed, they began to work together more often. Alara started helping in the fields, learning how to plant and harvest, how to feel the soil between her fingers. Samuel taught her how to tell when the ground was too dry or when the air hinted of rain. She listened carefully, asking questions, smiling at his patience. "Farming's about trust," Samuel said one afternoon, handing her a handful of small seeds. "You put something tiny into the dirt and wait, hoping it'll grow. You can't rush it. You just care for it and believe." She turned the seeds over in her palm, their shapes smooth and small, "Kind of like people," she said. "You care for them and maybe slowly they open up." Samuel looked at her for a long moment, then smiled gently. "You're learning fast," he said. That evening after dinner, Samuel brought out a small wooden box. Inside were carefully wrapped paper envelopes. "These belong to my wife," he said quietly. "She loved flowers, said a farm should never be just green and brown. It should have color too." Alara touched one of the envelopes carefully. She must have been kind. "She was," he said, looking down. "She used to plant these every spring. I stopped after she passed." Alara thought for a moment, then said softly, "Maybe it's time to plant them again." Samuel didn't answer right away. He looked out the window at the fading light across the fields and then nodded. "Maybe you're right," he whispered. The next morning they chose a spot behind the house, a stretch of earth near the old wooden fence where the sunlight stayed longest. Samuel tilled the soil while Alara knelt beside him, pressing the seeds into the ground with gentle fingers. They worked in silence, the only sound being the breeze and the rustle of the grass. When they were done, Samuel stood back and wiped the sweat from his brow. "Doesn't look like much now," he said. Alara smiled. "Give it time." For the next few weeks, she tended to that patch every day, watering it, watching it, waiting. Samuel would stop by sometimes, leaning on his shovel, pretending to check on her work, but really just watching her. One morning, she came running into the kitchen, her face glowing with excitement. "They're growing," she said. "Come see." Samuel followed her outside, his heart unexpectedly light. And there they were, tiny green sprouts breaking through the brown earth, fragile but full of life. He crouched down beside her. "I'll be," he murmured. "She'd be happy to see this." Alara looked at him, her voice soft. "Maybe she is." He smiled then, a real, deep smile that reached his eyes. It was the first time Alara saw him look truly at peace. From that day on, the garden became their favorite place. Every evening after their work was done, they sat by the flowers talking about everything and nothing. Samuel told her about his childhood, the horses, the laughter, the big family dinners. Alara told him about her homeworld, the crowded cities, the small dreams she'd left behind. They began to laugh more often. Sometimes she teased him gently when he forgot where he left his gloves, and he'd shake his head, pretending to be grumpy but secretly enjoying it. One quiet afternoon, Samuel brought out his old guitar covered in dust. "Haven't played this in years," he said shyly. "Then it's time to start again," Alara said, her eyes bright. He tuned it slowly, his fingers clumsy at first, but soon the soft sound of music filled the air. It wasn't perfect, but it was warm and real. Ilara sat nearby, humming along to a melody she didn't even know. When he finished, she clapped lightly. That was beautiful, he laughed softly. The guitar or the company? Both, she said. From that day, the evenings were never quiet anymore. There was always laughter, the sound of music, or the rustle of pages when Ilara read aloud from her book. The house that once echoed with silence now felt alive again, filled with two people who had stopped being strangers. Sometimes, Samuel caught himself thinking how strange it was that someone so different, someone from another world, had come into his life and brought it back to color. One night he told her, "You know, this old place feels lighter since you came." Ilara smiled softly. Maybe it just needed someone to remind it how to breathe. He looked at her, the firelight glowing between them. "And maybe I did too," he said. For a long moment neither spoke. The crickets sang outside, the stars shone quietly above, and something gentle settled in the space between them. Trust, respect, and a warmth that didn't need words. The garden continued to grow, small flowers beginning to bloom, their colors bright against the green. Samuel often stood there at sunrise watching them sway in the wind, and thought how they looked like tiny signs of hope. And whenever Ilara joined him, they stood side by side in silence, two people who had lived through storms and silence, now learning slowly, beautifully how to grow again. The first light of morning touched the fields softly, turning the golden grass into waves of light. Birds sang gently from the trees, and a thin layer of mist floated over the valley. Samuel sat on the porch with a cup of tea in his hand, watching the day begin. The sun's warmth touched his face, and he smiled quietly to himself. The house behind him was alive now. He could hear soft movements inside, the sound of Ilara preparing breakfast, the clinking of dishes, the faint hum of a song she often sang while she worked. It had been months since she came, but every morning still felt new. He looked down at his rough hands, the wrinkles and scars, and thought about the man he used to be. For years, this porch had been his only company. He used to sit here listening to the wind, wondering how long one could live without laughter in a home. Now that question didn't need an answer anymore. Ilara stepped outside, carrying 2 cups of tea. Her hair was tied back, and she wore a simple blue dress that moved softly in the breeze. She handed him the second cup and smiled. "You were up early again," she said. "Old habits," he replied with a grin. "The land still wakes before I do." She sat beside him, the wooden steps creaking under their weight. For a while, they just watched the sunlight spread across the fields. The flowers they had planted were in full bloom now, painting the land in soft pinks, yellows, and blues. "It's beautiful," she said softly. Samuel nodded. "It hasn't looked like this in years," he said. "I forgot what color felt like." Ilara looked at him and smiled gently. "You just needed a reason to see it again." He glanced at her, then really looked at her. The light touched her face, and for a moment he saw the strength in her eyes, the same strength that had pulled him out of silence, out of years of loneliness. He hesitated before speaking, his voice low and honest. "I was afraid you'd regret coming here," he said quietly. "You're young, full of life, and I've got more years behind me than ahead." Ilara looked surprised at first, then softly shook her head. "Samuel," she said, her tone kind, "do you think I came here for youth?" He didn't answer. She continued gently. "Where I came from, people have everything, lights, noise, machines. But they don't have peace. They don't have real hearts anymore. I came here because I wanted something real." Her words lingered in the air like music. Samuel looked out toward the horizon, feeling his chest tighten. "War and farming did this to me," he said again, echoing the words he'd spoken the day they met. "I thought those things took everything I had." "They didn't," Ilara said softly. "They shaped you. They made you the man who stands here now, the man who kept going when everything else stopped." For a long moment there was silence. The only sound was the rustle of wind through the tall grass. Samuel felt his throat tighten. No one had ever spoken to him like that before, not since his wife. "You remind me," he said slowly, "that life doesn't stop just because the seasons change." Ilara smiled. "Exactly. Some flowers bloom late, but they still bloom beautifully." Samuel chuckled softly, wiping his eyes. "You talk like someone who's been here her whole life," he said. "Maybe I was meant to be here," she said with a small laugh. They sat together for a long while, sipping their tea, watching the light move across the land. It was peaceful. So peaceful that Samuel almost forgot how lonely this porch used to feel. After breakfast, they went to the garden. The flowers were taller now, their petals swaying gently in the breeze. Samuel bent down and touched one of them carefully. "Your hands did this," he said to her. "Our hands," Alara corrected with a smile. He laughed quietly. "You're right. Our hands." The day went by softly. They worked together, cleaned the barn, gathered vegetables from the garden, and repaired a section of the fence. Samuel noticed how natural everything felt now, how her presence fit into every corner of his world, as if she had always been meant to fill the spaces that silence once owned. That evening, as the sun began to set, the sky turned orange and pink. Alara cooked stew while Samuel tuned his old guitar. When she sat down beside him, he started playing a slow, gentle tune. The sound floated through the air, mixing with the smell of fresh bread and the distant sound of the river. Alara listened quietly, her eyes on the horizon. "You play beautifully," she said. "Only because you're listening," he replied, smiling shyly. She looked at him for a long moment, then said softly, "You know, when I first came here, I thought I was just trying to start over. But now I see, I found something I didn't even know I was missing." "What's that?" he asked. "Home," she said simply. Samuel looked down at his hands, his heart heavy with emotion. "You've given this place back its soul," he said. "And maybe, you've given me mine too." The fire crackled softly between them. The night was calm and cool, and the stars began to appear, one by one, scattered across the dark sky. Alara leaned her head gently against his shoulder. "You don't need to apologize for your years, Samuel," she whispered. "They tell your story, and it's a good one." Samuel swallowed hard, his voice rough with feeling. "You think so?" "I know so," she replied. "You've carried the weight of a whole life and still found the strength to care again. That's not weakness. That's courage." He didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked out at the horizon, where the last light of day was fading. For the first time in many years, he didn't feel old or broken. He didn't feel like a man waiting for time to pass. He felt alive, as if life had started again right where he sat. When the song ended, they stayed outside a little longer, the air filled with quiet peace. The next morning, the world was bright again. The birds sang louder, and the garden seemed even more colorful. Samuel stood by the window, watching Alara hang laundry outside. She laughed softly at something, a small sound, but enough to fill the house with warmth. He smiled to himself, feeling a calmness he hadn't known in years. The years behind him no longer felt like a burden. They felt like roots, deep and strong, holding him steady for what had come next. As Alara turned and waved at him from the yard, Samuel raised his hand in return, his smile wide and true. And at that moment, he realized something simple but powerful. Life doesn't always give second chances, but sometimes it gives new beginnings disguised as them. He whispered softly, almost to himself, "Thank you for finding your way here." The morning sun touched his face again, and in its golden light, the old farmer no longer looked weary. He looked peaceful, because now, his house wasn't just a shelter of wood and stone. It was a home filled with laughter, color, and the quiet miracle of love born not from youth, but from understanding. And in that warm light, two souls, one weathered by years, the other brave enough to start anew, had found what neither expected but both needed most: a shared life, gentle and true.